Lecture 5, we're going to start to move away from our production possibility frontier for a moment to start to talk about specialization and trade. So when we've been looking at the production possibility frontier, what we've been assuming is that our economy can only consume what we produce. So whatever production that has occurred within the United States, or we looked at Japan, that production is what is consumed within the United States or Japan. When we're operating on that production possibility frontier, whatever we produce is what we consume. We know in the real world, again, that's not going to be the case. It's the case where many of the goods and services, or at least the goods that we're purchasing, are going to be consumed or produced outside the United States. So if we looked at our clothing, our computers, even when we call a call center, we find that many goods and services that we consume are going to be produced somewhere else. And so we're going to talk about that. How do we determine who produces the goods? How do we determine who specializes, what economies, what countries, and how do good countries and even individuals decide when they should trade? So again, what should each country produce? We're going to talk about two different types of advantage. The first is an absolute advantage, and that means that a country could produce, or an individual or a firm could produce a good using the fewest resources. So again, we often think about using labor, but it could also be capital and land. So we can produce a good using the fewest resources. So it could be that we're producing it the fastest, or with the least amount of land, or with the least amount of capital, or with the least amount of labor. And so again, absolute advantage, we're thinking about using the fewest resources to produce a good. So who can produce the good using the least amount of land, labor, capital? That's the country that has the absolute advantage in the production of a good. And so when we go back and we think about our previous example where we had the US and entrepreneurial ability, when we go back and we think about the example that we had previously where we had the US, and the US could produce computers or wheat, and they could produce a computer in 100 hours and wheat in 10 hours. And then we could compare them to Japan, and in Japan, they could produce computers in 125 hours, and they could produce wheat in 25 hours. And so the question becomes, who can produce these goods using the fewest resources? Again, in our example, we only looked at labor. We didn't focus on anything else. But the United States can produce a computer in 100 hours. Japan can produce a computer in 125 hours. So we know that the United States actually has the absolute advantage in the production of computers. They can produce computers with the fewest labor hours. All right, what about wheat? Well, the United States can produce wheat with 10 labor hours, and Japan can produce it with 25 labor hours. And so actually what we see is the United States has the absolute advantage in the production of both computers and wheat. Okay, and so again, this case, we were just looking at who can produce the good with the least amount of labor. This could also be, okay, well, the United States has much more land available so that they're better suited to produce wheat, and so we could produce wheat with the least amount of land. And so again, we could say that since our land is more fertile or whatever reason, we can produce wheat with the least amount of land, and therefore we have the absolute advantage. So it depends on what type of resource you're looking at. Most of the time for our class, we're going to be focusing on those labor hours. However, the other type of advantage, which is actually going to be the most important and type of advantage, and it's because what is our next best option comes into play. So who can produce the good with the lowest opportunity cost? So who can produce computers and give up the least amount of wheat? Okay, and so that's what's going to become very important when we're thinking about what each country should produce. So the more of one good we produce, the less of another good we can produce. So if we're thinking back to that good one, good two, the more of good one that we decide to produce. So as we decide to produce more computers, that leaves less resources available to produce wheat. But the question is how much? less wheat can we produce? And so that's going to be the question that we're going to ask ourselves when we have comparative advantage. And again, it's going to depend on how specialized our resources are. How good are they at producing one of those products? So let's go through our example again, actually using the United States and Japan. I thought I had this example in here. It might actually be in the last slide or in the last lecture, so you'll get a review of it again. But let's see that the United States can produce one computer. For every one computer, it requires an additional 100 hours of labor. And if I had to give up 100 hours, so if we had 100 hours less for the production of wheat, how much less wheat? That's the question. And so if it takes us 10 hours to produce 1 ton of wheat, in 100 hours, we can take 100 and divide it by 10 and see that in 100 hours, we could have produced 10 tons of wheat. And so to get one more computer, it costs us 10 tons of wheat. And so that's what we're thinking about in terms of that opportunity cost. The opportunity cost, and we're going to compare this opportunity cost with the opportunity cost of all other countries around the world, and we're going to see if the United States has the lowest opportunity cost of producing wheat, then they're the ones that should produce if they're the ones that have the lowest opportunity cost of producing a computer, then they should produce computers. Okay, so we're going to leave this here for just a little bit, and we're going to come back to it in our next lecture. But let's look at a specific example here where we have two countries producing coffee and wine. So in Argentina, we're producing 1 pound of coffee requires 2 hours, and 1 bottle of wine requires 4 hours. In Brazil, producing 1 pound of coffee requires 1 hour. Producing 1 bottle of wine requires 5 hours. And so first, let's think about absolute advantage. So who has the absolute advantage in the production of coffee? And the answer is going to be, we're going to compare 2 hours to 1 hour, and we can see that Brazil can produce coffee faster. They can produce coffee in using only 1 hour of labor, whereas in Argentina, it takes 2 hours. Okay, now let's move on to comparative advantage. Who has the comparative? There we go. Advantage in the production. And let's go to wine. Who has the comparative advantage in the production of wine? Well, in Argentina, producing 1 bottle, let's just put an A here. In Argentina, producing 1 bottle of wine would take us 4 hours. In that 4 hours, how much coffee could we produce? Well, it takes us 2 hours to produce 1. And so if we have 4 hours available to us, we could have produced 4 divided by 2. We could have produced 2 pounds of coffee. And so the opportunity cost of 1 bottle of wine in Argentina is 2 pounds of coffee. What about in Brazil? In Brazil, to produce 1 bottle of wine requires 5 hours. In 5 hours, how much coffee could we produce? And to do that, in 5 hours, we're going to take 5 divided by, it takes us 1 hour to produce a pound of coffee. And so in that 5 hours, we could have then produced 5 pounds of coffee. And so the opportunity cost of one bottle of wine in Brazil is 5 coffees. So we're comparing, if Argentina wants to produce one more bottle of wine, they have to give up 2 pounds of coffee. If Brazil wants to produce a bottle of wine, they will have to give up 5 pounds of coffee. Who gives up less to get a bottle of wine? Argentina. Argentina has the comparative advantage in the production of wine. They give up less in terms of coffee to get another bottle of wine. So Argentina has the comparative advantage in the production of wine. Okay, so what determines whether two countries should trade? Why might they decide to trade? These are going to be two important questions that we need to consider because we know that trading exists in the world. Why does the United States decide that we should produce things like clothing abroad and spend our resources producing other things domestically? And what determines where our clothing is produced? We're going to see that gains from trade arise in comparative advantage. Countries like China have access to a significant amount of labor. And since they have access to a lot of labor at a very low cost, they can then produce goods at a very low cost in terms of their opportunity cost, since they have so much labor available, goods that require a significant amount of labor. And so what we see is that the United States decides, okay, you have more labor than us, and you can produce these goods more cheaply than us. So you produce those clothing items, we'll produce technology and advances in the medical field, and then we'll trade. And so gains from trade arise from this comparative advantage. We specialize in what we're good at. Opportunity costs are different across countries because our resources are specialized in different things. In the United States, we have access to a lot of fertile land. That's not going to be the case in a country like Japan. So we can raise things like timber, we can grow trees, and we can sell them, we can export them to Japan since they don't have land that's available to produce trees. The opportunity cost of producing trees in the United States and in Canada is much lower than it is in Japan. When each country specializes in the good in which it has a comparative advantage, total production in all countries will be higher. The world's production will be higher and all countries will gain from trade. And so it's really easy in this economic time when we hear President Trump talking about the downsides of trade. And we're going to talk about, yes, there are downsides to trade, but when we specialize in what we're good at and when we trade with countries, we're going to see that our resources are allowed to be more productive. And this allows the world's production to be higher and the world's economy to be better. And so what we see in this case is both countries can benefit from trade if we're producing goods that we are producing, that we're specializing in, that we have the comparative advantage in. All right, so in our next slide, we're going to look back at the US and Japan